Okay, so hello everyone to this session on the rise of discontent in the European Union and what can EU innovation policy do about it. This session rises because discontent is increasing in Europe and elsewhere at an unprecedented pace. And much of this discontent is linked to a growing technological divide in which factors such as artificial intelligence, robotization, and platform economies are playing an important part. It seems from a certain point of view that technology and innovation are part of this problem. But the question that we're going to discuss is, can they also be a part of the solution? And in order to do that, we have 5 top speakers that are going to join us from different parts of Europe and different institutions, and are going to be covering this topic together with us. The system is going to be that they're going to be short presentations by each of the speakers, so 10-minute presentations, and therefore afterwards we're going to follow with questions from the audience. So please go ahead, put your questions in the chat, and I, as a moderator, will be selecting your questions and asking those questions on your behalf to the members of the panel. So without further ado, first panelist is going to be Louis Dijkstra, who is the head of economic analysis sector at the DG for Regional and Urban Policy of the European Commission. Louis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andres. Just want to make sure that you can see my screen and can hear me.
Yes, we can.
That's reassuring. I'll give you a quick introduction to Euroscepticism and a couple of the things we can do about it. But before I go into what we can do about it, I really want to give you an overview of where we stand today and what's driving this phenomenon. So, three key questions we want to answer. What is driving the discontent with the EU? Why is it higher in rural areas? And can cohesion policy actually reduce EU discontent? And on the right, you see the cover of a recent working paper Andres and I wrote on particularly that last topic. And I'll share the links for more information at the end. So what is Euroscepticism? It's difficult to define. I wouldn't want to do it on my own, so I was delighted to be able to rely on a large panel of political experts called the Chapel Hill Expert Survey, or CHESS. And they multiple experts assess all of these parties across the Union according to whether they are opposed or in favor of EU integration. And if you look then at the national elections over the past decade, you can see that actually the share of votes going to parties that are either opposed or strongly opposed to EU integration, or that are somewhat opposed, or strongly opposed, both have doubled over time. In the early 2000s, we have at about 12% of the vote going to parties that were at least somewhat opposed to EU integration. We're now at least 25%. So 1 in 4 votes goes to an anti-EU party. We can also see that right now, more people distrust the EU than trust the EU, and also that has grown substantially over the past 2 decades. And so we really are seeing a big rise in Euroscepticism and a big rise in the distrust of our union. But to analyze this, we wanted to look at a very fine spatial detail. So we collected data for over 63,000 electoral districts between 2013 2018 national elections. And that is going to be how we analyze the results. So here you can see 2 maps. On the left, you can see all the votes that went for the parties that were opposed or strongly opposed to EU integration. On the right, it also includes the parties that are somewhat opposed. So on the left, it's about 13%. On the right, it's 26%. And all the areas in purple are above the EU average, EU 28, as it was back before the UK left. And in green are all the ones which are below. A quick look on the left, you can see quite a few clear geographic patterns. You can see a north-south divide in Italy. You can see an east-west divide in Germany, with the exception of Berlin. You can see Prague jumping out there as still below average EU and Euroscepticism. The same is true for Budapest. But you also see a couple of countries like Romania, Spain, and the Baltics, where the share of anti-EU votes is really very low, 3% or less. But then if you look at the ones that include the somewhat opposed, you see a number of countries with the vast majority of areas are all at least 50% anti-EU. This is the case in the UK, where it includes the Conservatives, in Hungary, where it includes Fidesz, Italy, where it now also includes Cinque Stelle, which had a higher share at that time in the south, and also Greece. So we really see a big increase. But the key question is, what is driving these patterns, right? There's a lot of research has been done on populism, and we look at a lot of these factors, and we find quite a few of them are confirmed, but we also find a few novel aspects here. So we really find a very clear evidence that low economic growth or economic decline really leads to a much higher share of anti-EU votes, as do low employment rates, low shares of people with a university degree, low shares of young people, low densities, so rural areas, low turnout, but surprisingly higher GDP per head. So we find that places with a higher GDP tend to be more Eurosceptic than the ones with a lower one. I mentioned density. We took a look by degree of urbanization, looking at rural areas, towns and suburbs and cities, and the difference is really quite large, both for the median and for the average. I'm showing the median values here. The median vote for Eurosceptic parties is 8 percentage points higher in rural areas than cities, and it's 3 percentage points higher in rural areas than in towns and suburbs. So clearly there's a bigger concentration of Euroscepticism there. We took a look with a couple of different analyses to see what was driving that. Here we found clear evidence that increasing unemployment and a high share of non-EU migrants drove anti-EU vote, and declining GDP was especially important in rural areas. People from elsewhere within the Union actually reduce anti-EU voting, as does the tertiary educated, the young people. But interesting here, we checked for different age cohorts, and actually Euroscepticism seems to be linked with a higher share of middle-aged people. So it's not only the old people only are Eurosceptic in cities, or a higher share of older people leads to more Euroscepticism in cities, whereas a higher share of middle-aged people leads to more Euroscepticism elsewhere. We confirm turnout, and even within these degrees of urbanization, having a higher density at the neighborhood level still means less anti-EU voting. So bigger cities are less Eurosceptic than small ones. Towns are less Eurosceptic than suburbs, and villages are less Eurosceptic than dispersed rural areas. So moving on to really the key question here, and I have to confess, I was terrified when Andres and I started this work, because I wasn't sure I wanted to know what we were going to find out. There was a hypothesis out there that actually getting money from the Union through cohesion policy has either no effect on Euroscepticism or might even exacerbate it. It's a little bit of money, but the impact's too small. You still feel left behind, and you dislike the Union even more than you would. So I was terrified that we would find that cohesion policy actually increases Euroscepticism. But so here we wanted to find out what's the answer. I'll leave you hanging there for just a second. But first, a question: how can it influence it? Well, it can influence it directly if people are aware and appreciate the EU-funded projects, or it can also be indirectly if the EU-funded projects have a positive effect on growth, on quality of life. People might be more positive, and that positive effect might also include the Union, even though they are not aware of the source of that funding. But I want to highlight there's a lot of Euroscepticism in rich member states and in richer regions. Remember that higher GDP led to more Euroscepticism, which of course cohesion policy cannot address. So on the right, you see the correlation between the investments that we do in the past programming period at the national level and the share of people in the country who are aware of EU support to regions and cities. And basically, it's a very clean split between the countries that get a lot of funding, primarily the Eastern countries and the ones that don't, primarily the Western ones. Few exceptions are Portugal and Greece, but high awareness in the countries that get a lot of money, low awareness in the countries that don't. So what did we find? We clearly found that cohesion policy is linked to lower shares of Eurosceptic voting. Now, I want to start with a caveat. This is not our goal, right? Cohesion policy's goal is to improve growth and quality of life in EU regions, not to affect electoral outcomes. But if you're spending 50 billion a year, you would like people to know, you would hope that they appreciate it. And if they, you hope it would influence their opinion of the union. And we've looked at cohesion policy as a whole. We looked at its separate funds. We looked at the 2 previous programming periods separately combined, and all of them reduce anti-EU voting. So that was very reassuring. I wouldn't know what I would have done if I found the opposite. We even went as far to look at specific policy domains. Here it gets a bit complicated, but just bear with me. First, we looked at how much was being spent. And we see that if you spend a lot on social infrastructure, on human resources and RTD, these policy domains are linked to a lower share of Eurosceptic voting. There were others where there was no impact, and even a few where it actually was linked to higher Eurosceptic voting. But then we also looked at the share of that domain within all of the investments funded by ERDF. And again, we found social infrastructure, but for example, we also found transport infrastructure. So if you spend a little bit on transport infrastructure, that has no impact or a negative impact. But if you spend a large share of your funding on transport infrastructure, it actually helps. It reduces anti-EU voting. And the same is true for IT, energy, environment, and natural resources. So if you spend a large share on those, they do end up reducing your Eurosceptic voting. So the key winner here, if you will, is social infrastructure, where clearly if you spend money on it, it reduces, and if you spend a larger share of your investments on it, it reduces it even more. But cohesion policy cannot be the only answer to Euroscepticism. We can see that there is clear evidence that Euroscepticism is driven by low growth, low employment, low education, low shares of young people, low density and low turnout, but also by higher GDP per head. Rural areas are clearly significantly more Eurosceptic. Also there, we find evidence of economic decline, growing unemployment rates, and the presence of more non-EU migrants and middle-aged residents seems to boost that. But so cohesion policy reduces anti-EU voting directly and indirectly, but it can only do so in areas where we spend a lot. Now, that's primarily focused on the less developed regions. We've increased the category of the transition regions now up to 100% of the EU average GDP per head, between 75 and 100, instead of between 75 and 90. But still, there are a lot of regions with a higher GDP where we don't spend a lot, and there is still significant Euroscepticism. So it's not purely limited to areas with economic problems. So that's why I argue that if we want to tackle Euroscepticism in all areas, we need a very simple and clear narrative that explains to all regions, rich and poor, urban and rural, growing and shrinking, how all they can benefit from EU membership. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis, for this very interesting presentation with clear messages saying that cohesion policy can help cohesion investment more than anything else reduce Euroscepticism, but it's not sufficient, that there's a need to go beyond that and have other mechanisms. Next in line is going to be Marco Di Cataldo, who is a professor at the University of Venice. So Marco, the floor is yours, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Andres. I'm going to share my slides as well, if I can. Okay, can you see the slides?
At the moment, we can see Luis in the screen, but I don't know whether everyone else can see the slides. Yes, now we can.
Now I see you. Okay, great. Or maybe I see you again. Anyway, so thanks, Andres, and thanks to Wire for the invitation So in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to add up to what Louis has been telling us over the last, or the previous presentation, and focus again on the role of cohesion policy as a potential solution to the growing Euroscepticism in the EU. So again, we're going to focus on the potential that EU policy has in particularly less developed places. In the past years, researchers have focused a lot on this matter, and evidence that has been produced so far is actually quite mixed. So the paper that Louis has just presented, which has not terrified him in the sense that more money seems to be related to lower discontent. However, there are other studies, such as the paper by Fleetwood and co-author, but also others, that would have made him terrified because instead there is no relationship that is found. So in a recent work that we have produced together with the two co-authors, Riccardo Crescenti and Marajua, we have tried to kind of unbundle this seemingly conflicting evidence. And we have tried to uncover a perhaps clearer impact of EU policy, trying to understand whether clearly EU policy can be related and under which condition it can be related with reductions of Euroscepticism. And we have done so in two ways. First of all, the novelty of our contribution relative to existing one was that we have tried to truly isolate Euroscepticism with respect to any other individual preferences. So as we know, individuals can vote for Eurosceptic parties for several reasons, but we wanted to find the appropriate and ideal context in which voters were either clearly stating their appreciation for the EU or their dislike. And I think you all understand where I'm going with this. The context that we have chosen is the UK and the referendum on Brexit, where unequivocally voters were either stating their appreciation or not for the EU. So first thing, isolate Euroscepticism. And second, we wanted to isolate EU policy. As Louis was mentioning earlier on, there are a number of elements, large number of elements that could be related to Euroscepticism. So we really wanted to focus on EU policy in particular. And we wanted to understand what would have happened if the EU policy was not there in the first place in terms of Eurosceptic outcomes. In other words, we wanted to look for a counterfactual. So in our study, essentially what we do to try and understand whether EU policy is related to Euroscepticism and what are the channels, if there are, through which this relationship materializes, is to compare local areas in the United Kingdom that have received a whole lot of money from the European Union with very similar local areas, extremely similar across a whole set of relevant characteristics, except they did not receive the same amount of money from the European Union. And as I said, the goal is also to look at potential mediating elements in this relationship, some of which were mentioned by Louis earlier on, the impact of EU policy and the awareness over the presence of cohesion policy. So let me go to the results. This is a graph that can be interpreted as follows. So on the left-hand side, you can see dots referring to local areas where a lot of money was received from the European Union because they are part of so-called less developed regions, entitled to receive the highest proportion of EU funding. On the right-hand side of the graph, we have local areas that, again, are extremely similar. However, they did not receive the same funding from the European Union. That's the only thing that makes them different, essentially. And we're going to focus on these areas here inside this circle that, as I said, are extremely similar among each other. On the y-axis, we have the proportion of Eurosceptic preferences. Essentially, what we see here is that similar local areas display no difference in voting behavior, no difference in Eurosceptic preference. So a result that, again, would have worried Lewis, perhaps. So we conclude from this result, from this plot, that EU funding alone is not sufficient to reduce Euroscepticism. So on average, we don't find a result of this kind. However, as I said, we want to move on and understand whether there are some potential mediating conditions in this relationship. And in particular, as I said, the main goal is to look at whether or not the impact of policy, the capacity of cohesion policy funding to enhance economic conditions and create new employment opportunities can represent a mediating element that may make EU policy more strongly related to pro-Europe votes. This is indeed exactly what we obtain. So in this graph, on the red line, again, it's represented the relationship between unemployment decrease, so improvement in labor market opportunities, and Euroscepticism for high-funded areas, whereas the blue line refers to the same relationship for non-funded areas. And the fact that the slope is significantly different is telling us something very, very clear. So areas that have received a whole lot of money from the EU, where labor market improvements have been stronger, and clearly this is very likely related to the policy themselves, to the impact of the policy itself, well, these areas display less discontent towards the European Union, so are less Eurosceptic, as compared to extremely similar non-funded areas. So we also test another potential mediating element, the level of human capital existing in a region, that some researchers have argued represents an approximation for the extent to which people are aware of the fund or the capacity to absorb cohesion policy funding. Well, as you can see from this graph here, we do not see any differential behavior, any differential pattern between EU-funded and less funded areas. However, when we combine these two elements, these potential mediating factors together, improvement in labor market conditions and stronger human capital, again, potentially proxying awareness, well, the relationship now and the role and importance of EU policy, of cohesion policy, becomes even stronger than before. So it's the combination of these elements that seems to make the difference for the role of EU policy on Euroscepticism, that essentially is not going to work under any condition, but only under some specific conditions, when the policy has worked. So to summarize, the two key outcomes of our study are that, first of all, it seems that being in receipt of funding alone is not per se making local citizens more supportive of the European Union. So pumping money into areas that are Eurosceptic now will not automatically reduce Euroscepticism. It looks from our study that only in places where EU investments is coupled with the creation of new employment opportunities that clearly could be a direct result of these policies, well, citizens seem to be more likely to support the EU and to relate these improvements they have perceived and this positive transformation to the EU itself. So I'm gonna stop here and leave the remaining part of today's question for the session to the other panelists. Is innovation policy really suited to help? I'm gonna leave you with one last point. So smart specialization is the approach that the EU has chosen for the reform in innovation policy. We have conducted a study with Andres and Vasilis Monasteriotis that demonstrates that the way in which smart specialization has been applied so far is very far from its initial conceptualization and initial design. So the extent that policies need to be effective to produce an impact on Euroscepticism, it might not be the case for smart specialization. But I leave this for the next discussion after the panel presentation. Thanks. Over to you, Andres.
Thank you very much, Marco. This has been a fascinating talk, and I think there's a clear message here that is complementary to what Luis was saying, that although European funding, and European, in this case, European cohesion policy alone does not make a difference for Euroscepticism, you have to make sure that European cohesion policies are effective, that they deliver in improving labor market conditions, and that in combination with a greater awareness of the policy is going to be a driver reducing Euroscepticism, which I think is highly complementary to the type of work that Luis was presenting before. So thank you very much for that. And now we go to our third panelist, who is going to be Alexander Lemke, who is at the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities at the OECD. Alexander, the floor is yours, and as usual, you have your 10 minutes for the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anders. From my side, you're going to hear the word broad quite a lot. So far we focused on Euroscepticism, a very kind of specific element of the discontent we see, an important one. But at the OECD, we see discontent not just in our European member countries, but on a much broader scale. We've seen protests in Israel. We see the big divides in the current election in the United States, where you can really draw a line between some of the more affluent and better functioning places and those that don't do so well, that Andres in a very nice paper called the Revenge of the Places That Don't Matter. What we talk about is we see generally a geography of discontent, places that don't do so well, that where people are no longer content with the status quo, with the way things are running, with the established systems, and they're questioning this. They're expressing their anger, sometimes violently, sometimes peacefully, but very often at the ballot box. We saw the Brexit discussion. We see the elections right now, and what we're trying to understand is what can you do to actually acknowledge that there is a problem. How can we see what the problem, the underlying concerns are, and how can we improve the places where these people are to ensure that they actually get heard when they express their discontent. And one of the important things that we have when it comes to, or at the OECD, is that whenever we see something negative, we get contractually obliged to look at the positive. So for us, there's geography of discontent, there are challenges, but what we want to go for and what we're trying to find is the geography of opportunity. What are the things that we can do to improve the conditions in all of our member countries and regions? And the two things I want to flag are very much the aspects that we're also kind of already swinging through the interventions of my colleagues. One aspect is very much well-being, beyond growth, thinking a bit broader. And the second one is looking a bit specifically at what innovation policy can do and how we can use a broad-based approach to innovation policy to ensure that we reach every region, every place. Now, Andres gave a very nice introduction that focused on technological change, but one of the aspects we have to acknowledge is that it's not just technological change that regions have to contend with right now. We at the OECD speak about mega trends. We have demographic change, the aging, often even a decline in rural areas in some of our cities. We have the move towards carbon neutrality, net zero carbon emissions, and the disruptions this puts in place in certain regions. It's much more concentrated than other types of change. We have, of course, the technological change, automation, digitalization, and the COVID crisis accelerates a lot of those trends, and globalization, the international trade, the integration of our trade flows that brings tremendous benefits and very strong aggregate gains, but not necessarily to every place, not necessarily to every city, every region. So what we need to acknowledge, and that's the first aspect of that's crucial, is that there will be winners, there will be losers, and that a basic idea of the gains from the winners will trickle down, and in the end, everyone will be lifted up, is not something that has worked over the last couple of decades. It's something where we need to take an active approach. We need to intervene, and this is what the OECD calls no longer we're going for growth, but we're going for inclusive growth, a growth that benefits everyone. And when we say it benefits everyone, the kind of concept we have in mind is that it's very much about improving the well-being in all types of places. We recently released a report on rural well-being, the geography of opportunity, that provides a handbook, a guidebook, and develops a framework that can help understand how to improve the living conditions and how to get this done in a in a inclusive manner. And what we stress in this report are, first of all, that you need to be very much aware that regions, or even places that we call rural, are extremely heterogeneous. They're not the same. There are rural places that do very well. Often they're located close to cities, or they have natural resources that they can exploit. But there are many varieties of other types of places that don't necessarily do so well within the remote category, within the places that are close to cities. Or what we also have to see is sometimes what is rural is also located within a city. Now, what it means for policy is that we need to acknowledge that all of those different places will be affected differently by the megatrends. The people within them will be affected differently by the megatrends. And we need a different approach to support regions at different levels of development with different underlying characteristics and different underlying assets. So what is this approach when it comes to innovation policy? You might be surprised by now. We also have a book on that. And this book was developed over the last 1 or 2 years, working together and drawing from quite a few experts' papers that we had prepared for a series of workshops on this topic. And there, the idea was very much, what is the kind of approach to innovation policy we need to take when it comes to promoting innovation beyond the frontier, beyond the top performing regions? And what we see is, we always have in mind the Californias, the Silicon Valleys, the Kanto region, where Tokyo is located in Japan, when we think about innovation, R&D, patenting, and the amount of knowledge that's being created in those areas. But what's true is that there are very few of those regions that actually push the frontier in a very I don't want to say big sense, but the mass of kind of patenting, the mass of R&D investment that's being located in a handful of regions is extremely high. So if we take, for example, patenting, it's 10 large regions that account for 45% of global total patenting. Those are large regions. They account for 18% of the GDP within the OECD, but nonetheless, the innovative activity, when we just think about patents and R&D, is extremely concentrated. Now, what this means for pretty much all of the other 400 or so, or we're growing the OECD, 500, I think by now, large regions, is that we don't necessarily need to look for what works in those regions to try and build our innovation and try to support the firms in our region to become more active in the innovation field. What we need is a tailored approach that focuses on the system that we have in place, the capacity of our firms, the local academics, and the institutions that we have to support innovation in the region. And we have to make sure that we support the growth of the system by building links between those different actors and by thinking about how can we go from the position where we are step by step to improve our innovation system and innovation activity in our region. And this has everything to do with learning, with bringing in knowledge that's not necessarily created locally, but learning from every source that is available, from the firms in your region, from the academic institutions in your region, but also from beyond the region. How can you get knowledge into your region? And what we are working on at the moment, building on the prior steps, is to look at innovation diffusion. How can we bring knowledge to an area? How can we help our firms use this knowledge to become more productive, create new products, improve their processes? And we're looking to develop a toolkit that will help policymakers understand what are the bottlenecks in the system of flow of information and knowledge in the region and then uptake of this information in our firms. It will focus on 5 channels that are very much about linkages between different firms and players. It's about supply chain linkages. It's about the flow of people, the knowledge that's embedded in the people that come from different places or that move from one firm to another. It's about links between the university, the technology transfer offices associated with it or other kind of institutions, and the firms in the region. It is about the availability of advanced business services that I can use. And it also acknowledges that sometimes we just Google something and we find good ideas and integrate this into our processes. All of this builds on the innovation system, on the actors that are within a place. And I think this is why it is so exciting to be in an event that is the Week of Innovative Regions and in Europe, because ultimately when we talk about a system, when we talk about the links between different actors, it's not something that is global, it's interregional, but a lot of this is happening in the daily interactions and in the exchanges that we can have in the places where we live. I think I'm going to leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I think this is a fascinating talk in which, on the one hand, you go beyond, the idea that we need to go beyond growth and economic growth and focus on other aspects such as well-being. We also need to go beyond research and development and patenting when looking for the solutions, although those would be helpful, and focus much more on the ecosystems and build incrementally on the basis of what you have in place, but also through learning and the diffusion of knowledge and what can be done in order to enhance the capacity of individuals and firms living in regions to actually absorb knowledge that is being generated elsewhere. I think this is shaping very interestingly, and therefore I'm going to pass you on to the next speaker, who is Emanuela Bellan, who is the head of unit for interinstitutional international relations and outreach at the European Commission, and who has quite a lot of interesting things to tell you in the next few minutes. So, Emanuela, the floor is yours, 10 minutes like for everyone else.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, colleagues, and very happy to be here and very lucky to so far to have heard this very interesting analysis and ideas from the other speakers. If I may ask that my presentation appears on screen, great. Thank you very much. If you could move on to the first slide. Next slide. Okay, oh, great, yes. Okay, so I will have a slightly different approach. I work in the JRC, the Joint Research Center, which is the science and knowledge service of the European Commission. Our mandate, our strong interest is in promoting evidence-informed policymaking. That means that we support the Commission in policy preparation, but also in implementing policies that are adopted. This we do with the Commission, and that's why it's very, very relevant. We want to do it more and more at the local, national, regional level. The vast majority of legislation is EU legislation is implemented at the local, regional level. That's why we launched a project, a pilot project. The origins are a few years back, but this is the brainchild, let's say, of the European Parliament, who asked us to develop based on some pilot actions that we had done in previous years. And the pilot project is called Science Meets Parliament, Science Meets Regions. The objectives that you have on the screen is to foster dialogue and understanding between policymakers and scientists in order to make better laws, regulations, to sort out things better. What is relevant, and it's the last two goals mentioned there, is about citizens' involvement as a potential way to contribute to combat this disenfranchising or feeling of discontent, showing how science can contribute to making better laws and how they can be involved in making these better laws. At the same time, through this pilot project, we wanted also to show local administrations and give them capacities, tools, know-how to go on to be able to sustain these tools over time. Second slide, please. Okay, so the pilot project basically included three strands of actions. The first one was to organize events in capitals or local municipalities, city development agencies. So we had a range of beneficiaries who, through this scheme, organized 1 day, 2 days, 3 days events on themes and issues that were close to their hearts, were relevant and important locally. We also financed studies that were related to the subject that was chosen. The subjects went from developing the blue economy to how to deal with the influx of immigrants to, aging population, very different subjects. So these studies allowed usually local universities or academia to offer analysis, data to support policy making, and also suggestions to support policy making in the area. And then we also could finance some training courses for policymakers, always at regional and national level. And as you can see from the slide, we implemented this working very closely with the European Parliament and also with the Committee of Regions, who for us was a fundamental partner because the Committee of the Regions has a very solid link with regions and was an excellent partner in the implementation. Next slide, please. One thing that I want to mention is the innovation camps. This was for us a tool of choice to make the most of stakeholder involvement, especially citizens' involvement. We organized overall 25 events throughout Europe. 6 of the events were innovation camps, and we found out that in the end, these were the events with the most durable impact. Now, Innovation Camp is a concept that was a tool co-designed by the JRC, so us, with experts in participatory methodologies. It is vaguely inspired by the quadruple helix approach used by smart specialization. So cooperation with stakeholders from the public, the private, academia, and citizens, focusing on their needs. Innovation Camp involves a process that starts long before the event, whereby the local authority that owns the event, that took the initiative, that wants to discuss a certain policy problem with the stakeholders, identifies the stakeholders, involves them, briefs them, then the event is held. The objective of the event is to address a very real challenge, not through presentations and speeches, but through cooperation around the table amongst the representatives of the different citizens, in order to find and identify a project, a workable project that can be implemented. This tool has proven to be an excellent tool to involve stakeholders and to engage citizens. Engaging citizens early in this way allows to inform them, to make factual and science more acceptable to them, to make them feel heard, and also gives tools to the local policymakers to identify these people, to listen to them. So it's a very time-consuming. It requires real will and investment, but it's a very positive result that we've seen. And if I may go to the next slide, please. What you will see there is a map of the events. Well, you can hardly see, but 25 events throughout Europe. We started working in the Balkans as well. I want to mention a couple of events. For example, in Poland, we started in Wielkopolska with an event on hydrogen. The region wanted to push the idea of moving towards hydrogen-powered vehicles and energy. And there was a lot of resistance from the population, misinformation. As a result of the event, a dedicated platform was set up to address the concerns of the citizens and set up this dialogue. In Barcelona, we had a very successful innovation camp on fostering integration of migrant youth with representatives of social society and even migrant youth who came to talk about their experience and suggest ideas on how to improve their situation. Next slide. This again, just to give you an idea, you have in the different colors the different components of society that took part in these events. Overall, we had about 2,500 people who took part to the various events, where you see, according to the theme, to the format, you had a greater participation of policymakers and scientists, but also participation of representatives of the economy and citizens. And again, it turned out, I believe in all cases, to be a positive tool and test to support this dialogue. So with this, I will stop. It wanted to be just an example of tools and methods that can be, and we feel should be adopted at the local level to involve the citizens and find one possible way out of their resistance and their skepticism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emanuela. I think this is a very, very interesting case of how to do something that has been overlooked in many innovation policies, which is that of promoting civic engagement. Very often in terms of innovation, decision-making is taken by experts, by national, let's say, decision makers in a very distant location without realizing that that is likely to affect the quality of life and the development prospects of people living in different places. So this idea of the innovation camps, trying to bring in stakeholders, identify topics, discuss with them, involving the population, that has been already piloted in 25 different parts of Europe, is something that can be a very, very good method in order to try to address many of the roots at the heart of discontent, especially when it comes to innovation policies. So, and talking about innovation, there are very few people that know more about innovation than Beñat Bilbao Osorio, who is the deputy head of unit at DG Research and Innovation in the European Commission. And that will be the last intervention, last but not least, one of the very important ones. And Beñat, the floor is yours, and as usual, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Andres, and good afternoon, everyone. My presentation here is aimed at complementing what we had already heard from previous speakers, but providing an angle from the innovation perspective, and particularly on what we plan to do in DG Research and Innovation to try to address this challenge. Previous speakers have talked about cohesion policy, which is a very, very important tool in order to try to address this geography of discontent. But I would like to complement these interventions, also providing some of the practical tools that we are planning on developing in the coming months. So before I go to this practical information, if you allow me, I would start just saying a couple of thoughts in terms of how we see the challenge and what is our state of play to develop the tools that I will be presenting afterwards. So Andres in his presentation, and also Alexander and Luis were mentioning that what we see is that there have been increasing disparities in the past decades in Europe. So we know that because of the effect of these mega trends that Alexander was presenting, and in particular the rapid technological change that digitization has brought about, we see that some individuals, some companies, and some regions are gaining from this process, while some others are lagging behind. And this is what, in our view, is creating this geography of discontent, where we see people and companies that have difficulties in adapting to this rapid technological change. that are unable to benefit from the opportunities that they bring about, and that the adaptation and the transformation capacity that these technologies are bringing is disrupting how they are performing. What we also see is that, to a certain extent, digitization has changed the nature of innovation. And here also, building on what Alexander was mentioning, we see that there is a higher concentration of innovation, in particular core companies and in core regions, especially those that are associated with the uptake of digitization. And this is resulting in a slowdown in innovation diffusion. So companies that are located or are in sectors that are not where digitization is not permeating so much, they seem to be lagging behind and unable to cope with the rapid change that we are seeing. So this is a little bit what we have already been seeing for a few years, and what we see right now is that probably the situation may get even worse, or worse, or maybe even accentuated even more because of the need that we have to ensure that our economic growth is going in the direction that we want, in the directionality that we want, especially with the ecological transformation and this rapid digitization. And this may also create some sort of disruption and period of adaptation in some of those companies and some of those regions that may have more difficulties in adapting to the new situation. And also the COVID-19 crisis can leave some long-lasting scars in many companies, especially those that may have less resources to actually continue investing in their technological adaptation and in their innovation processes in order to be better off and gaining from these new opportunities that innovation can bring about. So what we see is that the situation may get accelerated or even infatuated even more as we move around. So based on this analysis, the question that we pose ourselves in digital research and innovation is whether we actually need a new recipe to address these issues. And then the question that you would ask me is, okay, but what was the old recipe? And I think that our recipe somehow has been very much focused on three big areas. So the first one is trying to boost investment on place-specific innovations, so innovations that are endogenous and that can be sustainable over time. We believe that investment in its own will not be sufficient, so we need to ensure the effectiveness and efficiency of this investment by creating the right type of conditions that we believe that will allow this innovation to flourish through reforms where necessary in the research and innovation systems, but also in building the right policies and creating the policy instruments that will allow for a faster diffusion of innovation, so that the companies, the individuals in particular regions can connect to these development hubs in a more efficient manner in order for innovation to flourish. And the fourth and final element here is about the institutional capacity, because even if the title of the workshop is focusing on EU innovation policy, somehow we must acknowledge that this is a common and shared effort, where I would even say that the lion's share of the effort will need to come from the regional and national dimensions in order to push this investment, in order to create the type of reforms, while in the Commission we can facilitate, enable and complement these efforts that we are doing. And this will require, and this is the fourth element that I wanted to mention, the need for strong institutional capacity at all levels in order to be able to design and implement the right policy perspective. So then the question can be rephrased whether we need a new recipe or not. I think that the ingredients that we need are probably the same. So the need for investment, the need for the right framework conditions, and the need for institutions. But I think that the sauce that is linking them together and where we are putting the emphasis, and I think that may change a little bit as we move forward. So based on this analysis, what do we plan to carry out, and what is our...
1 second, Beñat. I think we are only seeing your first slide, so maybe there's a problem with... if you can try to share again your screen.
Can you see now my fourth slide? What can EU innovation policy do?
Yes.
Okay, so as I was saying, now is I wanted to mention, what is our thinking on how we can go about addressing some of the situation from R&I policy perspective. And the first element or the first ingredient that I was mentioning there is how we can boost the necessary investment that we need. And I think that there are different areas there that we have pointed out. So Luis and Marco already mentioned that cohesion policy, especially because a big chunk of this cohesion policy is focusing on boosting the innovation capacity of the regions, will be a key ingredient. So by building the knowledge infrastructure, the capacity and the structural transformation of some of the regional ecosystems that we have there. We also have some investment that will be facilitated through the upcoming Horizon Europe, especially with an area of work that is aiming at widening participation in Horizon Europe and improving the access to excellence for all those regions that may be lagging behind. So where we have some of designated actions that I will mention later on. And then very importantly, also because of the amount of resources that will be devoted in the coming years, is the recently approved Recovery and Resilience Facility that is very much linked to the European semester exercise that we carry out every year, where we must ensure that part of this funding is also geared towards boosting the research and innovation capacity of the countries and of the regions in particular. In addition to having, just the different sources of EU funding somehow that can support these investment decisions, we should also mention that it will be very important to create the synergies between the EU funding schemes much more than what we have done in the past. And here is what I was referring to when we probably need a little bit of a different type of sauce to marinate all the different ingredients. And here we are working quite strongly in making it much easier to build stronger synergies between Horizon Europe and cohesion policy, especially through facilitating funding for the Seal of Excellence. So those projects that have applied and have been worthwhile funding, but due to the lack of resources cannot be funded by Horizon Europe, to be much easierly funded by cohesion funding, and also establishing the linkages with education and skills policies that are being developed at the EU. So that's in the first level of ingredients, so the level of investments. Then the second level in terms of improving the conditions for this investment to be more fruitful. I think that here we also have a couple of policies and instruments that can help regions and member states engage in this type of reforms. Particularly, let me just mention two. So the Horizon Policy Support Facility, that it's very much focused on boosting the innovation capacity of regions by supporting peer learning between different regional governments or national governments, but also providing expert support for analyzing, the situation of different innovation systems, and the technical support instrument, that it's a commission-wide instrument that is very much linked and focused in facilitating the adoption and design of the reform capacities that countries may need or regions may need more generally, and that is linked to the Recovery and Resilience Facility. The final set of instruments that we envisage going forward, especially with the adoption of Horizon Europe next year, is those type of instruments that will help, or that we believe that will help the ability of lagging innovation systems to reach a higher level of excellence, and that will support also stronger innovation diffusion in Europe. And here, very briefly, I would like just to mention fourth type of action. So the first one is under the widening participation and strengthening the ERA package, where we will be continue supporting the research collaboration between research institutions. So for those that are perhaps lagging a little bit behind, where the level of excellence is a little bit lower, trying to partner and team with those that are located in other in other regions that may be a little bit more advanced, so that we can create the positive synergies in that regards through the teaming and training programs. We will also create a knowledge exchange platform in conjunction with the Committee of the Regions, so trying to ensure that the peer learning is there and that is happening, and also a new initiative that regards how science meets the regions that will be conducted together with the GRC. That will also have this regional component in terms of how science can inform policy. The second type of instruments will be on supporting talent in regions. So through the ERA4U initiative, we will continue and even boost more the mobility opportunities of researchers across regions. The third area will be focusing on strengthening the innovation ecosystem. So we are still thinking and trying to refine how we are going to make this in practice. But the idea of the creation of what we call the ERA hubs, so where we will have different actors working together, boosting the networking and supporting how research and innovation ecosystems links together internally, but also with other ecosystems in other regions will be emphasized. And finally, the fourth type of actions that we will carry out are on the more traditional ERA disciplines that will be trying to create this European market for research and innovation for knowledge somehow that is behind that, by creating better opportunities for researchers and mobility for researchers, supporting open science or access to research infrastructures across the Union. So these are just a few of the thoughts that we have in mind on how from the European Union we can support that all the regions can maximize their ability to take or to benefit from the opportunities that the technological change that Andres was mentioning at the beginning will open, and that they don't feel that they are lagging behind. But just to conclude and to summarize what I was mentioning, I would like to highlight just three main points, so three key messages from my side. So it is clear that ensuring that we address this geography of discontent will not be easy. It's a very complex challenge that we have in hand, and will require many different components, where innovation policy will be one of them. I think that it is important to acknowledge as well that the European Union and our policies, let's say at the Commission level, will be one of the key ingredients, but by no means will be the most important one. I think that a lot of the effort will have to come from the regions themselves and from the national administrations themselves, who will need to prioritize their investments in particular complex situations as we move out from the COVID-19 emergencies, and but nonetheless, the prioritization of these investments to support their long-term growth through research and innovation will need to come from them as well, and that in order to make it more efficient, we will and they will need to design and implement the necessary reforms to improve the conditions. From our perspective, from the EU innovation policy perspective, what we can try to do and what we are intending to do is to ensure that we draw new investment and build the stronger synergies across programs, so that the investment dimension can be there. We are also facilitating the technical capacity and providing technical advice and capacity for advising on some of the reforms that may be needed in order to improve the framework conditions. And finally, we are also defining a set of initiatives to boost the regional ecosystems and to improve the knowledge diffusion. And this is what I had in store with my presentation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Beñat. I think this is very interesting and wraps it up very well. The idea, I think you highlighted the conclusions very clearly, but let me just repeat some of them. That there's this geography of discontent, and tackling it is not going to be easy. It cannot be done alone by innovation policy, it cannot be done alone by the European Commission, but it needs a concerted effort of policies and different agents in the whole process. That the European Commission needs to work together with national governments and regional and local governments in this respect. And I think even more importantly, in the end, your conclusion is that the European Commission is very much aware of the technological and innovation divide that is opening across the whole of Europe. And there's a need not just to redress that technological divide, but also to focus on developing the innovation capacities of many areas of Europe. And that includes issues like institutions, improving institutions, supporting talent wherever it is, improving the local ecosystem in terms of facilitating the capacity to generate innovation, and as importantly, and linked to what Alexander said before, this whole idea of supporting open science and the diffusion of science and research infrastructures in order to facilitate this first creation of networks and pipelines, and also through talent and better institutions, the reception and assimilation and use of that knowledge at the local level. I think what we have had in this session of 5 presentations are a lot of very highly complementary views about what is this knowledge, this geography of discontent, how does it relate to, on the one hand, the processes that we have seen of unequal innovation and technological change, and how, at the same time, innovation with other policies, with other agents, can become not just part of the problem, but of the solution. So now it's time to open the debate to the audience. And unfortunately, we have lost Louis Dijkstra, who was disconnected and has not managed to log in again. So there has been some trying to get him back, but he couldn't. So we're down to 4 members of the panel. And there were some questions coming from the audience. One has been already replied by Louis Dijkstra before he was disconnected, but I'm going to ask the question to all the other members, the second one, which is, how is the role of some disinformation media, so perhaps through social media in Twitter and Facebook, and what the person asking is saying, some subversive elements promoting the skepticism and anti-European stances across the EU. Does any of you want to go into that? Yes, Marco, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. The question popped out while I was speaking, so I don't know whether it was for me or for Lewis. So in our study, don't know who asked the question, but it's actually a very important point. In our study, we tried to take into account the role of the media because, well, we've discussed already the importance of awareness of the policy. Now, awareness of the policy can mean several things. It can mean that you're aware that policy is doing good to you, or you are misinformed in a way of what the EU is doing. And this is something that is indeed happened in the case of the UK, for example. We have clear evidence of misinformation going through Facebook or other social media or tabloids and so on and so forth. So I think one of the key tasks for us researchers is to try and factor in this element into our study. As I said, we have tried to do so. However, we didn't succeed as much as we wanted, in the sense that we have tried to collect information on local newspapers and try and understand to what extent misinformation or media exposure to certain type of media could be an additional mediating element on the role of EU policy on discontent towards the European Union. Because certainly this is a key element. As I said, it was way too difficult because we were working with the local areas. So it was very difficult to collect information at that unit of analysis, but certainly it is in our agenda, and it is something that has to be taken into consideration because, again, it could help us understanding the real role of awareness and the way in which this can be distorted in a way.
Okay, thank you very much, Marco. Unfortunately, we cannot tell who is asking the question. They come from Juarez Lido, but let me just bring here the crisis and the current crisis that we're seeing, which is the COVID-19 crisis, which, as Alexander said in his presentation, seems to be accelerating many of the trends that we had behind. And one of the main changes that we have witnessed with COVID has been the rise of telework. Distance working seems here to stay, but the OECD has recently highlighted that the capacity of workers to work remotely is far higher in core cities than in less developed regions, in less developed towns, and also rural areas. What do you think, Alexander, in your view, can be done in order to make sure that this jobs divide is not enhanced as a consequence of the switch to remote working, and as a consequence does not lead to greater discontent within Europe?
I think this is probably one of the most important questions people ask themselves at the moment. In general, there are two aspects that are worth considering. The first is what is happening to the places as they are. So what is the ability of people to telework who are already in those areas? What is the need to telework because you have to face lockdown measures, curfews, and other kind of restrictions? And the second question is, what does it mean for the attractiveness of places going forward? Will there be a shift where more teleworking will actually bring opportunities for areas that have lost jobs, that have lost people because the big cities attracted them, and there is more space, cheaper space where you can live, work, you have a garden, you can go out. And is this something that regions can leverage? On the first element, I think the crucial aspect is we have to acknowledge that some activities are necessarily physical. Some activities are something that is really hard to do digital. And if you can do it digitally, the risk is less that you don't have the right skills or you can't do it from your home. But the risk is that if you digitalize those types of occupations, they actually become automated. Instead of having people work in a factory or in agriculture, you use machinery, you use tools. And this is much related to the general trend of automation and technological change that we have to address. So there, what we need to do is we need to be prepared to see what are the kind of jobs at risk, what are the kind of tasks that are being replaced, and to prepare the people in those places, the firms in those places, for the change that is to come. It's not something where we can close our eyes and hope it's not going to happen, but we have to take proactive measures to ensure that the right skills are there and that people who are currently in those jobs have opportunities to transition, ideally locally, and if not, to see where opportunities for them arise. On the other element, whether we can actually create new opportunities in less densely populated areas through new modes of teleworking, because people flee the big cities and try to have the best of both worlds, the big city job with the rural lifestyle. We have to see how this shakes out. It's at the moment, we are still very much in the COVID crisis, and we see, I think in Paris, it was 200,000 people who fled during the first lockdown. Where this is maintained is very much a question, which actually, if you allow me, brings me to one question that rose for me when it comes to the current COVID crisis. Both the JRC and we and the EC in general love the idea of peer learning. I think it's a very effective tool, bringing people together, exchanging and developing joint solutions, learning from others. But at the moment with the crisis, it's actually very hard to bring people together. It's something that has been impossible for us for the last 6 or 8 months. And my question is whether we see opportunities to develop digital tools that can mimic this kind of approach, or whether we really lose out because we cannot bring people together anymore.
Thank you very much, Alexander. We have another question from the audience, which I think is very relevant. It's all about the timing and how fast can these interventions that are being planned, especially by the European Commission, but also those that are being recommended by the OECD, can take hold. And the question is, can, in this case, EU innovation policy, but any type of innovation policy, provide results fast enough in order to prevent the negative aspects of this populism or anti-system explosion from taking hold? So who wants to go for it? I don't know whether Beñat, you want to.
Yes, maybe I can have a first take at it, and maybe others may want to complement afterwards. I think that before answering that question, I think that we need to take a little bit of a step back and see, what's the root cause of the technological change that is happening, and the speed and the depth of the changes that are happening, and the disruptive capacity that it has, and whether our policies can be fast enough to be able to counteract these negative effects. First of all, we all need to recognize that the acceleration of this technological change through digitization is incredible, and that the depth of the change is really very, very important. And this is somehow what is creating the big challenges on how do we ensure that we can have a quick enough transition so that people and places are not left behind in this rapid technological change period. I think that what we are trying to do, it's twofold. I think that on the one hand, we are trying to develop EU policies on our side, as I was mentioning, so trying to support the networking and linkages to accelerate and to counteract this slowdown on innovation diffusion. But it's certain that it will take a little bit of time. So innovation systems take time to be created. They take time to improve. But what we need to do is to have a decisive action and to prioritize this type of investment and actions in order to be able to cope with these negative reactions. And the second element is that we need to work much closer together with member states and with the regions in order to adopt the type of policies that can accelerate also this change and that can accompany the changes that are needed. And here I'm not talking only about technological change or innovation per se, but this will have to be accompanied very strongly by a skills strategy that will allow people to change, to adapt, and to contribute to the new processes.
Okay, thank you very much, Beñat. I think you have put a big emphasis on the whole issue of forging partnerships between the European Commission and nation states and regional governments throughout. But I'm going to go beyond, and Emanuela emphasized in her presentation the need to involve citizens in the discussion, the need to give voice to the citizens, especially in those areas that are being left behind in terms of innovation policy. Let me just be the devil's advocate with you and ask you a question. Why should citizens be involved in areas that are as complex as scientific evidence and innovation policy, when traditionally this has been something that has been fundamentally left to the dialogue between scientists developing the technological change and the innovation on the one hand, and policymakers who will have to design and implement the policies on the other hand? What can citizens actually bring to this dialogue, and how can they improve and benefit the outcomes in terms of innovation?
Thank you for this nasty question. It's not nasty. Well, first of all, I would like to say that when I talk about science, I'm not necessarily talking about high incomprehensible science. I'm talking about facts. I'm talking about reality, and we've seen in past discussions or current elections how politicians and political discussions which absolutely take into account other elements, necessary elements like values and opinions and things like that, ignore the reality, the facts, and hence building policies on a shared understanding of reality is paramount and fundamental. And this is not science as complex mathematical equations that the citizens don't understand. The citizens understand reality very well. Why it's important to involve them, and why it's important to involve them, we believe, at the local, regional, city level. As I was saying before, first of all, legislation is in its great majority implemented in cities, in regions, by regions, so very close to the citizen. Hence, their involvement is important. The fact that involving them can allow to analyze issues that are relevant and important locally for the citizens, with authorities, the local policymakers that are known and trusted, and hence the citizens are more open to having a discussion with these local authorities. What we believe this brings is a better quality of legislation, but also, as said, a higher acceptance by the citizens who've heard about the science, the facts, the context, and are hence more convinced and happier with the end result. That is the reason. If I may maybe say something about a question that was discussed before about disinformation. I have very intelligent colleagues who've done a lot of research on this and are doing a lot of research. We have a recent report on technology and democracy. What is important to understand, according to these studies, is that we are now past the kind of age of reason that we all believe and we still believe that we live in, i.e. facts, just feeding facts through social media or through the media does not convince people anymore. This is because more and more we live in bubbles of opinions, similar opinions, but also because we should take into account how our brains are wired. And our brains are wired in such a way that emotions count as much as facts, or even more in forging our opinions. And hence, the traditional way of feeding facts, you spend so many million in your area, so you should be happy, and that doesn't work. And I think it's important that we collectively, institutions and politicians and regions, understand that to be able to communicate in a more effective way, not leaving, let's say, the miscommunication only to the bad guys, but try to communicate with people using these tools and entry points that work with citizens and with Twitter users and whatever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I think that's a very important point, this idea of communicating, that was also highlighted with Marco. But many of you have stressed in a very clear way the need to get all types of involvement, participation, and co-decision making in the innovation process. And I'm going to just throw the gauntlet to Marco now, because when you gave your presentation, you highlighted that there was another part which is important, and is about smart specialization. And in recent years, especially since the reform, the 2014 reform of the European cohesion policy, smart specialization has become a key part of the intervention in the European Union, especially in less developed regions. But my question to you is, smart specialization, as it has been implemented until now, a possible solution to this rise in discontent?
Right, thanks, Andres. So I think smart specialization potentially could represent one of the solutions. So it's a very interesting and important concept. I think it relates very well to what all the other panelists have mentioned during the presentation. So it's a place-based type of approach. The idea is to tailor intervention to the local needs, understanding what are the specific needs of each place. However, so far, according to a recent study that we have conducted together, it doesn't seem to have been implemented according to what were the initial guidelines, let's say. So it seems, from what we find, it is impossible so far to look at the actual impacts in terms of growth and employment because it's too early. But we can look, as you said, Andres, at the implementation. So it looks that regions, a lot of regions, way too many regions, have basically selected all sectors in their economy as potential sectors of specialization. So it's very far from what was the logic, the initial guidance of selecting just few sectors and untap the potential on those, let's say. And on top of that, it looks like the drivers of the selections of the strategy seems to be unrelated to the actual need and structural characteristics of the regions. There is actually one element that seems to matter more than anything else, and it is what my neighbors are doing, what neighboring regions are doing. So in other words, it looks like when it comes to deciding what to do, regions are somewhat copycatting from their neighbors. And this is kind of discouraging. So if regions are implementing strategies in this way, it may be that they are not producing the impact they should and they must produce in order to have an effect on discontent. If I may, I would also respond to one of the questions that were asked on the timing and on the importance of local and regional government, if we have time. Otherwise,
we are limited on time, so let me just move on. Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of the time. We have 4 minutes, so I'm probably going to ask 2 very quick questions, and if you can do quick responses. The first one would be to Alexander, which is, what I've been missing in this discussion is the role of industrial policy, but COVID-19 has put industrial policy at the center stage. What do you think can industrial policy do to address this rise in discontent that we're seeing throughout the world?
That's a tough one, given that industrial policy is something that is very much a living thing and a changing thing at the moment. Our traditional view is that industrial policy, picking winners, is certainly something we should avoid. I think our members are moving very much towards a more modern approach to industrial policy that links a lot more with what we see in terms of smart specialization, where you try to use a comprehensive bottom-up approach to identify what you're good at. And then ideally, and as Matteo was just pointed out, kind of not really in practice, you think about where you want to go and what are the transformative steps that you need to take to get you there. And I think this is exactly the problem that was highlighted before. Instead of actually tailoring your approach to your place, because of a lack of capacity, because of a lack of funding, because of a lack of ambition, there's often the kind of the sad truth that we try to just take whatever works in an area that's close, that looks good in the books of someone nearby, and we're not really trying to adapt what we need to do to our local place. So I think that's my short answer.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and also for giving a short answer. I'm going to probably ask the toughest question last to Beñat. He also was last in presenting, and it's related to how can we achieve a solution. You were a fundamental member of the Science, Research and Innovation Performance of the EU 2020 report that was published earlier this year. And in that report, it is stated that there are concerns that the new technologies may exacerbate social and geographical inequalities through job and wage polarization, income disparities, regional disparities, and winner takes most or winner takes all markets and industries. So how can this trend that seems inevitable linked to technological development be reversed, or can it be reversed? And you have 30 seconds to answer it.
Thanks, Andres. I think that the big issue there is not so.
So we lost Beñat, I think. Yeah, I'm afraid we lost him. So anyway, it's 15:58. We are within a minute. It's a pity because I thought that was an important question. I think this has been a very exciting session in which we have covered in a very comprehensive and very stable way many issues. So I would like to thank Emanuela, Marco, Alexander, and of course Beñat and Luis, who were there, for their participation. And of course, I would like to thank WIRE, the University of Split, and the European Commission for hosting this conference. And I hope that many of the discussions that we are having here would be later translated into clearer policies that would not just address the rise in discontent, but also facilitate more effective innovation and investment policies that might go beyond just generating growth, but also providing much better employment and greater happiness and well-being for the people in Europe and elsewhere, wherever they live. So thank you very much for your attendance, and looking forward to seeing you all during the rest of the conference. Thank you.